Okay, and for this final chapter, we're gonna just kind of work on the finishing touches. We're gonna make a ground plane for him. You saw a little bit of that in the last render. We're gonna set up a little bit nicer lighting, and then we're gonna take it into Photoshop to just give it that little extra polish that we would give to a character before we send it off to the client. Nothing major, just little things to kind of compensate for some of the things in the Brazil render. So what I did here is I made a matte shadow material on this plane, and I just want to adjust the lights really quick. The matte shadow material is a material that allows you to cast a shadow in the alpha, but it won't show up in any color information. So if you have a black background and you copy your whole thing from the alpha, from say a TGA, you'll have a nice shadow kind of being cast from it. So what we'll do is we'll actually exclude it from all these lights, and then add an area light that is the only thing that actually affects that shadow. So first thing we do is go to the Brazil RS lights, and then we make this quick little area light here. We're going to turn off the target because we just don't need a target on it. We're going to go to disk area for the type, and we're just going to align it. This is how you would align it to something. You would just set it to XYZ location and XYZ for rotation, and it'll actually just snap it right onto the object. Then we're going to shrink the diameter a little bit. We don't need it to be too big, but we want to attach it to the correct light. We want to attach it to the brightest light we have. So, just like we did a moment ago, we use the align, click on it, have the rotation and the location being checked on. And then in the include exclude options, we want to include plane 01. And then for shadows, we also want to include plane 01. So here we go. We got both those included. You could also just check the both option. It'll take care of both of them at the same time. I'm going to scale up that plane a little bit so that it fills the view a little better. Then make sure all the lights are pointing in the right direction and they're all in a place that we're happy with. We also want to exclude both the illumination and shadow from all of the normal lights, because we don't want this to be casting any crazy shadows in other directions. We only want one shadow being cast. It may be a little bit less accurate technically, but it looks a lot better when you've only got this one nice soft shadow being cast in one direction. So then we're going to rotate the camera. Right now we just want to get everything set up for this final large scale render we're going to do. For this DVD I had to do a very large scale one for the large printout and for the DVD cover. But for work, usually maybe you do about 2048 max, maximum size. Unless you had to do something for print. We do a lot of stuff for video game covers, or for E3 we do a lot of stuff for posters and marketing materials. So sometimes we have to go pretty high with our renders. So by grabbing that null that we made a long time ago, that little helper, we're able to rotate it without rotating our camera or light information or our character, and get new positions for the camera to render. And also, if we wanted to render a turntable, we would just animate that and just have it rotate 360 degrees. So the pose doesn't look quite right still. We're just going to adjust it a little bit more. And you thought we were done from last chapter. We also want to make him dance a little bit. So I want to hide all the BIP objects because they will render and it'll look like he has weird multicolored clown boxes sticking out of his flesh. Which gives me an idea. So here's as it's rendering with the new lighting information we did. I gave it a brighter backlight, you can see. It's a little bit less washed out lighting, basically. Wanted to have a nice rim light on him. So we're pretty close to being finished here. We've really we've posed the character, we've added a bit of a ground plane for him. I'm going to grab that ground plane off here. And looks like we're going to have to recreate it just so you guys can see it again. It's a matte shadow object that we're going to apply to this plane. Want to make sure that the opaque alpha is off and that receive shadows is on. And I'm going to hide everything except for the boots so I can double check and make sure that this is rendering correctly. As you can see, it's not right now. And the reason is because a while ago, if you remember, we turned on material override in the Brazil options. So we're going to have to go turn that off. So if we open up, get that out of the way. Take a look at the lights. We want to make sure that everything's being included correctly. Which it was. It's just that we still have to turn off that override material. And as you can see, we still don't have that turned off, but you can see what the shadow is doing at least with this. It's got a nice kind of fuzzy fall off and then it kind of drifts away. So, at this point I've actually forgotten that we have the material override on until right now. So here we go, go under Brazil render pass control. You can see we have a custom material on, so I'll just turn that off. And if we render out the region again, we can change that color to whatever we want. But one thing too is that it might be nice to add a little bit better material to this character before we render him out too. So it doesn't matter what you use at this point. I like to have something with a little bit of shine to it. And kind of a dark color. I always like this multi-layer material. It's got a nice kind of nice look to it. And we're just going to add a little bit of a noise pattern to it. Just a tiny bit to kind of break up the render. If it's just a gray kind of color, it's kind of boring. So adding a little bit of noise to it can be an interesting way to add a little bit of grit before you get to the texturing stage. So we're just going to use a noise. Turn it down a bit. I'll probably have to turn it down a little bit more than this actually. And we want to set that to object XYZ because we don't have any UV maps for this character right now. And I'm going to set the tiling up a little bit more. Now, although on this ball it looks okay, when we actually render it out, we're going to find that some parts don't work so well. So one of the last little things we got to do on the cleanup here is attach this this boot object together. In the last one where we put the rig on it, we actually already took care of this. But here's what we did. So this was a renderable spline, what we have right here. We turned it down to about 3 sides. And then we turn this into an editable poly. Or editable mesh, really. Which was simply done by collapsing that symmetry. And then we wanted to clean up a little bit of this because you can see it overlapped a lot. This is kind of the last little bit of detailing we're going to have to do before taking this into Photoshop for the final bits of edits. So we just got to make sure that the silver pieces are actually attached to the boot now. And then we'll just use a soft selection on the laces to make sure that they bend around and really fit in there a little bit nicer than they are right now. You can see there's still some penetrating areas here. So we're going to delete the one side that we didn't do any work to by putting a symmetry modifier on top. And just grabbing by element and deleting that whole side. And then flipping the symmetry. And kind of just give it this one little last pass over before we have the skin attached to it and do the final renders, really. This was the last little chunk that was kind of standing out, that there were some floating bits and things just weren't looking as good as they should. So we just have a little soft selection on those laces to kind of pull them into place. And then just a couple last little edits on the renderer. We want to make sure the material's looking good. The multi-layer material, which I usually like to use for these final renders, when it's only in the texture mode, of course, or excuse me, when it's only in the modeling mode. And make sure that our image sampling is on a good setting. Set our materials to scene, and then we render it out. And we take it into Photoshop, and I save it as TGA so that I can actually have an alpha on here. And you can see right there that it saved out an alpha from that matte shadow pass that we did. And that keeps it with a black background, so when we copy and paste it on top of each other, you'll notice in a moment that it keeps a black soft shadow going. So we can use that to start making our final image that we would send to a client. So first thing I do is copy it off to its own layer. That's one reason we save as TGAs, is so we have the alpha in there. It's also a good format to keep the detail. And then the most important thing we really are going to do here is just we duplicate that layer one more time and add an unsharp mask at a fairly low setting to it, and then set that opacity of that layer to about 80% before we collapse it. The reason we do that unsharp mask is because Brazil and Max have a kind of blurry render sometimes, and for stills it really doesn't look as nice as it could. So by running that unsharp mask, it's just a quick way to have a little bit of pop in your image. And so the last bit is really just adding kind of a gradient to the background that kind of simulates a ground plane, and maybe just little details here and there. If you see any areas that maybe got penetrated in the mesh, you might want to do a tiny paint over, maybe sharpening the hair since we didn't spend too much time on that, but we want to kind of give them the idea of it. And then running a very low feather on your character, inverting that selection and deleting to make sure you don't have that black halo around it since we rendered on a black background. And that really kind of covers it for everything we're going to do here. If you're going to do this for a large-scale printout like we did for the cover here, we might spend a little bit more time on the background and a little bit more time on the character to make sure he holds up at such a high resolution. But this is pretty much covering it for what we would do at Blur to get a character through production. We got to go over some poly modeling tools. We got to do some ZBrush. We went over the hair and the rigging, and then we finally just come into Photoshop for the final renders. And that's basically the character pipeline at Blur, and that's really how we handle things there. The last little bit we're going to do is just kind of crop the image and make sure it looks nice for the final renders, and that's about it. So I really thank everyone for joining me on this, and I hope you guys learned something and enjoyed it. And I also hope that you tune in for the next DVD, in which we're going to go over a lot of texturing. We're going to use Body Paint 3D and show how it integrates with Max really nicely. We're going to go over ZBrush a lot, also for enhancing some detail, for adding normal maps, and even for doing some texture painting. We're also going to do a lot of stuff in Photoshop and go over every sort of UV mapping you could imagine. And then we're also going to take this hair that we did and make it look a heck of a lot better and more professional, and really integrate well with the head. And then lastly, we're going to reuse this rig that we have, so I can show you how you can reuse rigs that once you've made one, you don't have to spend very much time making them again and again. So just once again, really thank you everybody for listening, and I hope you enjoyed it, and I'll see you on the next DVD.